a member of the graduate economics faculty with the Poole College of Management. His PhD degree is from Cornell University, and he's been at NC State since 1978, year after I was born. He's also been a visiting professor at Duke University. He's published 12 books and over 300 articles and reports, including his newest book, North Carolina and Beyond the Connected Age, the Tar Heel State in 2050. He can be frequently seen and heard and read in the media. He has daily radio programs aired on stations throughout the state, and a bi-weekly column entitled You Decide is carried by over 40 newspapers in the state. He's made close to 300 personal presentations.
3,000.
3,000, I'm sorry. In Walden, he's won numerous academic and public awards, including 2 Champion Tuck Awards for Excellence in Broadcasting, the UNC Board of Governors Award for Excellence in Public Service, the Order of the Longleaf Pine, and the Holiday Medal for Excellence from North Carolina State University. He's also served on several state and local commissions and is currently a member of the NC Future Investment Resources for Sustainable Transportation Commission. His newest book, Real Solutions, Common Sense Ideas for Solving Our Most Pressing Problems, will be published in 2020. So with all that being said, it's a distinct honor to have you here speaking for us, and I really appreciate it. Please give him a hand of applause and introduce him.
Can everyone hear me? If I don't need this, I won't use it because I've got 2 things in my hand. Pleasure to be here with you. I know I stand between you and lunch, so I will take that responsibility very seriously. I always like to start with a little bit of levity, try to make it connect to economics. I'm not always successful. This is actually a true story. I was born in Ohio. One of the most famous Buckeyes of all time was Bob Hope. He was actually born in England, but lived most of his life, or grew up most of his time in Ohio, Cleveland, so we claim him. The story is actually from a biography I read about him, and he lived to be 100 years old. His wife also, Dolores. And the story, unfortunately, picks up when he is on his deathbed, literally. He's dying, he knows it, his family knows it, doctor knows it. So he has a daily visit from the doctor who checks on Bob to see if the time has come where the family needs to be called in. And one day that time has come, so the family has visualized Bob Hope in bed, his wife Dolores right next to him, his family, all family, close friends around the bed. And he's unconscious, which he most of the time is. But occasionally he will become conscious, and that happens. Dolores sees her husband's eyes open. So she leans into him, picture her right there by his bedside in a chair. She leans into him and whispers into his ear, "Sweetheart, there's something we've not discussed." And he's now awake, focused, and she says to him, "Where do you want to be buried?" And to show you that Bob Hope had his humor until the very last seconds of his life, he looked at his wife and said, "Surprise me." That's a true story. And the reason there's a tie into economics, and that is that I think the reason most of you tolerate people like me speaking to you when you could be doing lots of other things is that you think that economists can, to some extent, prevent you from being surprised about the economic future. That is, most of the time when I give talks, people will listen to me, yeah, Walden, we know, you're showing us where we've been and where we are now, but I really want to know about the future. So that's the tie-in to Bob Hope, and I will try to give you some my views, my personal views on where the economy is going. But like most talks that economists are going to give you, I'm going to give you a little look back. What you're looking at here is a chart, and of course we love charts and we love numbers, but it's a chart that shows the growth of the economy quarterly. It goes back to 2016. And this is a number, a metric that you probably hear about. It's called GDP, Gross Domestic Product, which is a measure of everything we produce, everyone that's in doing anything economically. What you do is in there, what farmers do, what factory workers do, what college professors do. Don't ask me a question about how's that measured, but supposedly everything of economic value that's done and reported is included here, and then we just simply track how fast that's going up over time. We take out inflation, so these numbers cannot be inflated just because prices are going up. So if you look at this, you can see there was a clear bump up in growth in 2018. Now this was after the Tax Reform Act of 2017, which passed at the very end of 2017, was put in. And a lot of economists expected that because people responded, businesses responded to the incentives that were embedded in that tax act to produce more, to invest more, et cetera. But in 2019, you can see a downward trend. In fact, first quarter was very poor, but a downward trend, which many economists also forecasted that these benefits of the Tax Act perhaps would not be long-lasting, and we'd settle back to around maybe a 2% growth rate, and that's about where we are now. Now, there are some forecasts that suggest that in the coming quarters, maybe our economic growth rate will become even lower, maybe 1.5%. The Federal Reserve of Atlanta has a model that tries to predict GDP growth rate. I think they're predicting for the third quarter, which we're in. No, we're in the fourth. We're in the fourth quarter, but we don't have third quarter numbers yet. They're predicting maybe 1.7%. The point is that if you think about, the way I like to describe economic growth in the economy is think about driving a car. Let's say you're going the speed limit. Let's say you're going at 45 miles an hour. Obviously, you're making progress, and so that would be similar to the economy growing, the economy expanding. We're making progress. We're increasing standards of living. Our economic engine is moving ahead. Now, let's say for whatever reason you slow to 25 miles an hour. Well, that's still making progress, but you're making progress at a slower rate. That would be a slowdown. And if the economic growth rate slows from the 3% level it was last year to, let's say, 1.7, 1.5%, we're still growing, but we're in a slowdown. A recession would be when not only does the car stop, but you go backwards. You get farther away from your destination. That would be akin to GDP growth being negative. So when people, I've heard a lot of people and I've heard some commentators say, well, we're in a recession right now. No, we're in a slowdown. The economic growth rate is slowing. We're not in a recession. We need some negative numbers on there to be in a recession. And actually, it's now been 10 years since the last recession. Of course, the last recession was a doozy. We call it the Great Recession because it was so bad. That ended in the middle of 2009, and we've been growing since. And in fact, that's now record territory. That's one reason why some people are worried that we're going to have a recession soon, because we're on territory in terms of continuous economic growth that we've never been before. We have never grown for this consistent length of time in our nation's history. So this is where we've been. Now, I'm going to run through several slides rather quickly. Now, one of the benefits of economic growth is that more jobs are created and the unemployment rate goes down. And we are now, this does not incorporate the last reduction. We are at a 50-year low in the national unemployment rate. And that's reflective of the fact that the economy's been growing. If you look at, however, labor force participation rates, whenever political campaigns are run, someone like me and my colleagues, we like to listen and see if do the candidates say anything, do they use economic language, do they use it correctly, etc. And one of the things that I was happy to see discussed in the 2016 campaign was this exact concept, labor force participation. All that means is if you take the people in the country who are within typical working ages, and let's see, I think this uses everyone between 18 and 60, and there are various definitions of this, but if you say, all right, most people between 18 and 60, they're going to be working, and you take out folks who are officially disabled, who can't work, and then you say, all right, of those people between 18 and 60 who can't work, what percentage of them are working? What percentage of them have a job? And you can see that that's been climbing since the end of the recession. But notice we're not anywhere near the peak. And in fact, that was a historic peak in roughly the late 90s when almost 65% of people in the working age category were working. We'd never been that high. Now you might say, all right, well then why have we've been improving on this recently, but why haven't we gone back to that peak? Well, a couple of major reasons. One, young people especially are staying in school longer. Used to be, if I go back to my late father's generation, he was born in 1922. When he came back from World War II, he dropped out of college, or dropped out of high school to go out of the war. Came back from World War II, had no interest in going back to school. So he studied under some, he called them Dutchmen, who were carpenters, and he was a carpenter all his life. And so he was, roughly 20 when he came back, let's see, 22, no, he was about 22, 23 when he came back from the war. But he immediately went to work, and he worked for the next 45 or so years, and started a family, got married, started a family almost immediately around 23. Now, what you find is young people, I think 90%, it's an amazing number now, 85–90% of high school graduates at least apply to go to college. It's amazing. And so there's another 4 years of school. A lot of them continue on, well, a lot of them don't finish in 4 years, unfortunately. Many of mine are on the 6 or 7 year plan. You may have children or grandchildren who are doing that also. We're trying to fix that, but anyway. But even if once they finish, a lot of them now are not stopping. They're going on to graduate school. So you're looking probably now at, and I don't have the exact number on this, but probably it's 28, 29, 30 before a lot of young people now get their first paying job. Then they've got student debt to pay off. They maybe enjoy themselves for a couple of years. So you're probably looking at a young person today not settling down, to use that term, marrying or partnering and having children, 10 years beyond what my father did. So that's affecting this also. The other problem we know that does exist, and you see this particularly in rural North Carolina, is we have a fair number of people. It's estimated maybe 6 million nationwide, maybe 250,000 here in North Carolina, who for a variety of reasons just don't have the skill set to work. And it may be because they've got issues, addictions. It may be that they've got parents they can continue to live with. But that's an issue, and that's particularly an issue in some of our rural counties. So we're probably never going to get back up to that 65%, but at least we've seen climbing. Labor productivity has picked up. That simply means how much work people are doing in a given period of time. That's improving. That's tied into better wages, which you can see here. Wages have been going up, not fantastically, about somewhere between 2, 3, maybe 3.5%. But you got to remember inflation's low. And in fact, speaking of inflation, that's one of the bright spots of our economy. The inflation rate has been very, very low. In fact, around 2%. Federal Reserve actually thinks it may be too low. And to put that in context, and that, again, this shows my age. It was mentioned I started my job at NC State in 1978. The big issue then was what? Inflation, and are we ever going to be able to get ahead of the rising cost of living? Because inflation for 3 straight years, I think 70, 79, 80, 81, inflation was over 10% a year. I think it peaked at 13% a year. Mortgage rates, because there's a big tie between rates you have to pay to borrow money and the inflation rate. If you wanted to buy a house, you know what you have to pay on a mortgage interest in those years? 17%. 17%. So we've changed dramatically. I never thought we'd see this world where, if anything, a lot of people think, a lot of policymakers think inflation is too low. But anyway, it is. Now, I'm sorry to use the jargon here, the Phillips curve, but I do want to mention this because when I was in I took my first economics course, I think in 1969 or 70. I can remember this. I was in one of those real big, probably a lot of you experienced this, big auditorium classes, 300-400 kids. and the professor was Dr. Herman, remember his name, Dr. Herman, up on the stage. He'd walk back and forth. This was before PowerPoints or slides or anything. He just talked. He was a great teacher. He really got me motivated to study economics. I can remember him trying to describe the concept of marginal utility. Marginal utility is simply an idea that says that the value of each successive unit of a product that you're consuming, goes down the more you consume. And he demonstrated that, or he introduced that by talking about when he had lunch, and he would go over to a little hot dog stand near campus. That first hot dog he had, boy, he really was good. He really put a lot of value on it. He'd probably be willing to pay a lot more for that first hot dog. But by the time he got to his 7th hot dog, and he was a big guy, so you can imagine him doing this. But anyway, one of the concepts that I can remember learning in 1969 was this notion of the Phillips curve, which simply said you can't have two good things at the same time. The two good things you can't have is low unemployment and low inflation. Policymakers have to choose one or the other. You can't have both. Well, actually, we have had both for several years now, and which has resulted in a whole lot of my colleagues scratching their heads and saying, well, what was it? What happened? And we think globalization is responsible for that. One of the good parts of globalization, logistics, automation, weak unions, et cetera. So that's a positive that we've seen in our economy. All right, let me talk about some danger points in the economy. One is household debt. We all know now, with the benefit of hindsight, which is the best way to analyze, to understand something is studied in the past. We all know that the Great Recession of 2007, 2009 was really prompted by you and me, households, having too much debt. We were up to our eyeballs in debt. A lot of it was mortgage debt because people got in the notion that we got to buy a house, got to buy 2 houses. I remember my wife, who was a very frugal person, wanted to buy some beach property in, I guess that would have been 2004, 2005. And I'm very risk averse, and I convinced her not to, probably should have. But anyway, people were loading up on debt, particularly mortgage debt, that prompted or fueled the housing boom. And so we had, if you look at debt, not in terms of the amount of debt people have, but the carrying cost. How much are you having to pay out of your paycheck as a percent of that paycheck for debt? So what you would do here is calculate what's your mortgage payment, what's your car payment, other kinds of payments as a percent of what you earn per month. And you can see we got very high, these aren't percentages, you can just look at the relative position here. Very high right before the Great Recession. And this is probably the big question of that recession, is what really prompted people to think that, all right, housing prices have peaked, we got to get out and make our profits. Because once that happened, it began a cascade and really led us into the biggest financial collapse in the country since the Great Depression. But anyway, it did happen, and people began during that recession a lot of people went bankrupt, but people became very frugal. In fact, this is one of the things that I take credit for predicting, that I said this was probably 2009, 2010, I said one of the lingering legacies of the Great Recession is people are going to turn tightwad. They're going to turn stingy. And indeed, what's happened since then is, although people are taking on debt, they're taking it on in a very responsible way, watching how much debt they can afford out of their paycheck. And so right now, people are not overburdened with debt in terms of how much they have to take out of their paycheck. So that doesn't seem to be a flashing red light. If you look at delinquency rates, that also reflects that good news. If you look at the business side, I won't go into detail what this is measuring, but again, same story here. Businesses, yes, they've taken on more debt, but they've kept it in proportion to what their earnings are. And even the federal government. Even the federal government, yes, I know. All of you will tell me, and you're right, that the national debt has more than doubled in the last decade. But if you look at the payments, interest payments, think of the federal government as you. So again, what matters to you in carrying debt is how big are those debt payments out of your paycheck. We can do the same thing for the federal government. We can say how big are the debt payments the federal government makes on the national debt out of either the size of the federal budget or revenues or out of the size of the economy, and here we are. again, much lower than it was in the 1990s and 2000s. That's one reason, incidentally, why we've not heard a lot about the national debt in recent years, because it fits into the budget. Now, whether it will stay there or not is another matter. So the bottom line here with all these comparisons, financial comparisons, is many of you probably hear this. If you listen to talking heads, talking economists on CNBC or MSNBC, Fox, whatever news channel you listen to, most of them, not all of course, but most of them are saying, well, if you look at the economic fundamentals, they're pretty good. Fundamentally, there aren't some glaring issues out there like debt that suggest that we're headed for dire economic times. Now, that doesn't mean we're not seeing some slowdown, which I've already alluded to. If you look, for example, at consumer spending, it has flattened out in recent months. If you look, for example, at business investment, it has begun to soften somewhat. And if you look at some other indicators like manufacturing production, even the production of services, they've all softened. But my view right now is that those are indicative of a slowing economy, still growth, but slower growth, not an outright recession. Now, the stock market, of course, one of the reasons that economists look at the stock market is, well, we wished we could figure out how to make a lot of money there, but I gave up on that a long time ago. But one of the reasons that we look at the stock market is because it's almost like a daily vote by people with money. They're voting with their money on the future of the economy. Because in general, when the stock market goes up, that means investors are optimistic about the economic future. If the stock market goes down, that means they're pessimistic. And we've actually seen the market. This is maybe not a good representation of this. The market's actually been fairly steady over the last year and a half. And we had a big run up in early 2018. We had a big run up actually in 2017. We had a big run up in early 2018. But really, since the middle of 2018, the market has been fairly stable. There are some who say it's overvalued. There are a lot of it that's very hard to detect. That's why, for example, we're into earnings seasons. If you watch the financial news this week, it's all about earnings, because the price of a stock is related to the earnings per share of that stock. In other words, in order for a stock price to be supported, there has to be the company has to be making money, which is what earnings are. And so you'll see that value go up and down this week depending on what companies are reporting earnings. But most economists think the earnings reports are probably not going to be as good as they were a year ago, but they're not going to be disastrous. So I'm not one of those who think the stock market is on the edge of a decline. Now, if you ask me what is the biggest threat or challenge the economy right now, I think, and if I lined up 10 economists here, you'd probably get most of the 10 to agree, which would be very, very unusual. And that my biggest threat is the trade situation, the trade wars. The Trump administration has been engaged in renegotiating a lot of our international trade deals. They've been successful on some. We have a new deal with Japan. We have a new deal with South Korea. We do have a deal for a new NAFTA, but it has to be ratified by the House. That gets into political territory, whether that'll happen or not happen. We have, however, some outstanding disputes with the EU. And of course, the big one is with China. Now, let me back up. Why did the Trump administration decide to take this on? I mean, they could have not. They could have said, no, we're just going to go along. Well, I think I think part of this reflects the president's personality, but I think also it does reflect some genuine issues we had with some of these deals. Everyone agreed the NAFTA deal needed to be updated. Everyone agreed. Whatever stripe of economist you are, that deal had been done over 20 years ago, before a lot of the technology that we use has been developed, before the energy markets dramatically changed with our emergence as an energy power. So everyone knew that deal needed to be updated, and actually we did get a deal, although again it has to go through the ratification process. We've had issues with China, Japan, or, I'm sorry, we've had issue with Korea and Japan. We do have deals there. The EU, we've long complained that the EU doesn't take our farm exports because they want to support their domestic farmers, even though if you just look at it logically, the EU would be much better buying a lot of their food from us because we're a bigger country, we're more productive farmers than they are. But so there's been some squabbles there. The big one, of course, has been with China. And really, if you look at the history of our trade relations with China, China really became a part of the World Trading Organization, if you will, in 2000. Prior to that, China was out of everything in the world. Really, China emerged as both a political and economic power in 2000. And that was lauded, that was praised. But over the years, and this really went back even to the Clinton administration, but certainly the Bush administration and then successive administrations, we've had three problems with trade with China. One is that we argue China doesn't open up their markets as much to our companies as we open ours to theirs. Number two, if you are an American company and you're doing business in China, you have to not only compete against private Chinese companies, you have to compete against what are called state-owned companies. And they get subsidies from the Chinese government. And we say that's not fair. But probably the biggest complaint has been that China uses rules that they impose on companies wanting to do business there that allow them to get at companies' intellectual property, their secrets. And what China essentially does is says, all right, in fact, I'll use a real world example. I read about of all things, a dog food company, American dog food company. It's been very successful, I won't use the name, who've been very successful in our company. China is middle class in China is growing by leaps and bounds. Chinese families are doing a lot of the same things we do, so they're having pets, domesticated pets, dogs, cats, etc. Those animals need to eat. So this successful U.S. dog food company said, hey, let's go set up shop in China. Let's set up a factory in China and get into that market. It's a lucrative market. And so they went to the Chinese government, of course, and said, we want to do business. China said, fine, we'd love to have you, fine. But there are going to be two conditions. Number one, we're only going to give you a 5-year license. It's renewable, but we're gonna tether you for 5 years initially. And then secondly, you have to take on a Chinese partner. And the American dog food CEO looked at this and decided not to do it because what he was worried about is, number one, the Chinese partner, because they were a legal partner, would have access to all of their internal ways of doing things and manufacturing secrets, etc. And then he was worried about after that partner is sort of in the hen house for 5 years, then the Chinese will say, no, we're not renewing your contract, thereby allowing that Chinese partner to duplicate that factory. And that's a problem. I think you can logically see that's a problem. So the Trump administration, again, you have to decide whether the tactics are right, has decided that, well, previous administrations who complained about this, and this goes back to the Clinton administration, did complain verbally in the sense of trying to convince the Chinese to change this just by talking, or in some cases taking them. There's actually a trade court that's affiliated with the World Trade Organization, taking China to court. Nothing happened. So I think the Trump administration decided, well, if we want to get any change here, we've got to impose some pain on China. We got to show them we really don't like this, and the way we impose some pain on them is to place tariffs, which is just a tax, on products they are selling in our country. And so we've done that. Now, of course, China, each time we put tariffs on, they've retaliated and put tariffs on our stuff. So that's where we are. We are at this situation now where China is having to pay tariffs on stuff they sell in our country. Our people are having to pay Chinese tariffs on stuff we sell there. The tariffs make it less lucrative, reduce profits on both sides. It's been estimated that our economic growth rate, which I've said has slowed from about 3% to, let's say, 1.5%, would be up to 2% if it weren't for this trade war. So that's significant. That's significant. and China's growth rate has slowed. We're always skeptical about the Chinese numbers. We think they overstate them, but their growth rate has slowed from about 12% a year to 6% a year. That's the official rate. So that's the issue. That's where we are now. A couple weeks ago, the president and Vice Premier Wei shook hands and said we've got the outlines of a deal. Now, the outlines of a deal are not a deal, so we will see if this goes through. The current thought is that getting a deal is too important, both economically and politically, to both sides. That there will be a deal, but it won't be the massive deal that we wanted, that will address all three of those things that I mentioned. Because China has really pushed back on the requirement that U.S. companies who set up shop there take on a partner. They've really pushed back at that. They've said, hey, this is interfering in Chinese internal affairs. So my guess is there'll be some agreement on that, but it'll sort of be finessed. I'm not confident that'll change. But I do think the parties are probably at the point now that this has gone on for almost 2 years to say, look, it's hurt both parties. We've got elections in our country coming up. The Chinese don't have similar elections, but their president can be ousted by the Politburo Bureau there. So I think both leaders are probably coming to the point where they think some kind of a deal will be warranted. Did you, real quick question?
Who needs who more? Do we need them more, or do they
They need us more. They need us more. Trade, international trade to their economy is like 5 times more important than it is to ours.
What percentage of our economy is dependent
3%.
upon
3%.
3%?
Yeah, it's very small. That doesn't. What this trade war has exposed, though, because I've gotten this question, people said, "Well, we're a big country. We can do anything. Why do we need to trade with anyone else?" And actually, that's pretty close to the truth. But what happens is, and those of you who have run businesses or around with businesses know that most businesses needs to buy inputs. They need a supply chain. And I'll just use the traditional teaching example. Even though, let's say, Walden Co., let's say Walden Co. needs to buy widgets as an input. And let's say widgets could be made in our country. There could be companies that make widgets in our country, but the Chinese have been making them cheaper, so Walden Co. buys widgets from China. And our widget industry has gone away. We can do it, but it's gone away. Well, if we have a tariff on widgets that I buy from China, that makes it more expensive to buy those, and I'd say, boy, if we can get them for at least even the same price from an American company, I'll do it. But you can't build a widget supply chain overnight. It takes time. So that's what you're hearing from a lot of business people. They're saying, I just can't, I still got to buy from China because there are no substitutes. Now, long run, yeah, there would be, but short run, there's not. But yeah, this is much more important to the Chinese than it is to the U.S. And then the question becomes, and I've had people tell me this, Walden, you don't understand the Eastern mind. They'll hold out. They can endure pain. Well, we'll see. But anyway, my prediction is we'll have some deal within, I'd say, by spring. All right, your food I think is on the way, so I'm going to hurry a little more. We're also worried about foreign economies. EU, Japan are flirting with recessions. We've got Brexit that's casting a shadow over Europe and especially the UK. So although because we're not dependent upon trade like most. I mean, Europe is very much dependent on trade. Still, these are impactful around the margins. Now, the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve did something very, very odd the first of this year. Federal Reserve typically raises interest rates when the economy is growing in order to temper that growth so it doesn't get too robust and cause inflation to pop up. And they've been doing that since 2014. They typically lower interest rates when the economy is well, usually it takes a recession to do that because it's very, very hard to know. Usually we're in a recession before we know it. And so they lower rates when we're in a recession. So the Federal Reserve was raising rates 2014 up until early this year. They've changed course. They've actually lowered rates, twice this year, and they're meeting next week. They're expected to lower them again. So you might say, what happened? What's going on? Two things going on. One, there's no inflation to worry about. So the Fed doesn't need to raise rates to choke off inflation. There is no inflation. And number two, the Fed rightly has been following the data, and they see that the economy has slowed down, and they see that there's a lot of concern about recession. So they want to do their part to make credit cheaper so that people, business people, consumers who are buying homes will borrow, and that obviously creates economic activity. Very, very unusual. I know of only one other time since I've been following the Fed in my professional career that they've done this, that has changed course, went from raising rates to lowering rates, even though the economy was still growing. And that was, I think, 1996 under Greenspan. Similar circumstance. If you go back and read your Wall Street journals that I'm sure you keep, like I know I'm teasing. 96, in fact, Bill Clinton, who was running for re-election, was worried, very worried, that he was going to be running during a recession, which is generally not good for an incumbent president. And you have to make your own mind up whether Greenspan lowered rates to help Bill Clinton. I don't think so. But anyway, Greenspan did lower rates during '96, which did help the economy continue to grow for another 3 or 4 years. All right, let me say a little bit about North Carolina. We've actually been we go through cycles just like the nation. So if the nation has a recession, it'll hit here, even in the triangle. But if you look at the numbers since the last recession, we've been growing faster, whatever metric you use. Now, one of the big reasons, though, is, and I'm not taking anything away from our policymakers and our great business community, but one of the big reasons why we continue to grow faster in the nation is people are still moving here from other states. My wife's home state of New York, losing people. My home state of Ohio, I think, is growing, but not very fast. If you talk to our commerce people, they'll say attracting businesses from the Midwest and the Northeast, that's fertile hunting grounds. As people like North Carolina. They like our weather, they like our varied topography, they like our higher educational institutions, they like our lower cost of living, which we do. I've got a friend whose wife sells real estate to out-of-state buyers. She specializes in out-of-state buyers, like from New Jersey. And she's just cleaning up because you get a high-end buyer from New Jersey who's used to looking at prices for 4,000 square foot house, maybe $1.5 million, comes down here and can pick that up for maybe half the price, and their eyes get real big and they sign on the dotted line. So, so we continue to attract people. In fact, we rival. There's a metric called net in-migration rate, which simply measures the number of people moving out of your state compared to the number of people moving in as a percent of your population. And we're always on the plus side there, people more moving in than moving out. But do you know that we rival on that net metric? We rival Florida. Florida does usually beat us, but not by much. So we have a good story here, and that's reflected in people moving here, and that's reflected in high growth. Now, there have been several good things that we've seen in the last couple of years. One, non-metro counties in North Carolina have been sharing more in the growth. You hear stories about some interesting stuff going on in Rocky Mountain, interesting stuff going on in Hickory, interesting stuff going on in Goldsboro, for example. The economic growth cycle has been getting into non-metro areas, which is good. The tech sector is still booming. Middle-paying jobs are coming back. We've seen increases in manufacturing jobs, construction jobs, transportation jobs, and fewer counties in North Carolina are depopulating. The book that was mentioned that I published in 2017 about the future of North Carolina in 2015, when I wrote that book, of course I did most of the writing in 15 and 16, the state demographer was predicting that 1/3 of North Carolina counties, 33 out of 100, would depopulate between now and 2050. Now the state demographer has revised that and is saying only 17 out of 100 counties will depopulate. So I think that's reflective of some good news in our non-metro areas and our rural areas. I do a little index, leading index for North Carolina. If you want me to be on the mailing list, just send me an email. It was actually pretty good at predicting the Great Recession. It went down consistently starting about a year, no, actually 2 years before the Great Recession hit. Now, you may worry about this. This is Florence. This is Florence. Florence, you can clearly see the impact of Florence, not only in the Wilmington area and down east, but you can see the impact statewide. But since Florence has hit, we have had a rebound, and we're trending. We're not trending. This is not a growth rate. If this is trending even, it simply means the current growth rate is going to be maintained. If it's going down, it means the growth rate is going to get slower. If it's going up, the growth rate is going to get faster. So the fact that it's moving sideways is actually a good thing. All right, the last thing I want to, here are Walden's views on the big picture. No, I don't see a recession, obviously, this year. And I'm in concert with the National Association of Business Economists. These are people who, usually they're people who have advanced degrees, master's or PhD, but rather than working in an ivory tower like I do, although I get out and I do get out and interact with real people like you. They work for businesses, and so they really have to work hard at their forecast or they can get fired. So their latest forecast is about 1 in 3 of them think a recession will occur in the next 2 years, 20 or 21. That means 2 out of 3 think it won't, and I'm in the 2 out of 3 camp. So I think we're in a slowdown. I don't see a recession in the foreseeable future. I can certainly be wrong, but that's my current view. I do think, well, then you can go down and look at those other things. The last thing I do want to talk just real briefly about is NC First, which the first stands for Future Investment Resources for Sustainable Transportation. This was a commission set up by Secretary Trogdon. We have 12 members, myself, well, I'm one of them, but we have Mayor McFarland, we have the Mayor of Banner Elk, we have former State Treasurer Janet Howell. We have several business people there, and our charge is to look at primarily how are we going to get money in the state for roads and other transportation projects. And you might say, well, we'll get it the same way we've always gotten it. Most of it comes from the gas tax as well as some other fees. Well, maybe not. If people move to vehicles that don't use gas, or if people use more mass transit, or if people just don't buy cars, which the millennials and the iGeners are not buying cars at the same rate of old people like me, then what's going to happen to those revenues may not do the job. In fact, there's some forecasts of big declines in gas tax revenues in the next several decades. So I think I can't say more about Secretary Trogdon. To his big credit, he decided he needed to bring some people together from various parts of the community who could contribute looking at where we're going for transportation funding, and if we needed to make changes, where are we going to make changes. And we've been meeting about every other month this year. We'll do the same next year. We will issue our final report at the 2021 Transportation Summit. And we haven't made any, we're just in the listening and studying phase. But I will say that in terms of revenues, clearly something we've already discussed, and we'll probably make some recommendation, yay or nay on it, will be a mileage fee. Mileage fee would be an easy way to address the situation that fuel use is changing. So if you're just relying on one kind of fuel, gasoline, as people move to other kinds of fuels, well, then you're out. It also takes into account that that's really how much people use the road, and miles does really measure their use of that road. Now, mileage fee would probably be adjusted for weight of the vehicle. So I think we're going to be looking at that. We're going to be looking at the various role of the various modes. Are there some futurists who think the age of the automobile is gone? At least as we know it. People are going to ride share, people are going to use autonomous vehicles, people, as areas become more dense, are going to use mass transit. So we're going to try to take a deep dive in that and see if we can spot any trends that will inform our decision makers. So this has been, I'm very honored to be on this commission. We have a website, so if you want to see what we're doing, if you want to get to the materials we've been looking at, they're all on a website. And as I think this is a very, very important issue. So let me stop, it's right at noon, maybe time for 2 burning questions, and then I'll let you get to your meal. Sir?
If, the state were to do away with the state income tax and just raise the sales tax, how would that affect industry and business in the state?
That's a good question. I didn't see that one coming. Well, one obviously a pushback there would be income taxes tend to be more progressive in the sense that what you pay, what a taxpayer pays as a percent of their income, tends to be a little higher for higher income people than lower income people. Consumption taxes are more broad-based. There is some literature that's, I'm not going to give you a straight answer on this, by the way. There is literature that suggests that states that don't have an income tax, Texas, Tennessee, Florida, and rely on things like sales taxes and other taxes, are more attractive to economic growth. And I guess you could say that our General Assembly, and again, I'll just let you decide whether that they've been right or wrong on this, but clearly there has been a big shift in our tax portfolio, if you will, in the last 5-6 years, in the sense that the General Assembly has gradually reduced rates on the income tax, both the corporate rate. I think we went, North Carolina went, from having one of the highest, if not the highest, corporate income tax rates a mere 5 or 6 years ago, to now one of the lowest in the country. And we've also seen reductions in income tax rates, and we've seen a broadening of base of the sales tax rate. So we've sort of moved in that direction. And you have, I had a debate actually with one of my colleagues at Duke. I argued that you could actually see a little bit of a positive impact of this on our growth rate since 2015. He argued based on studies he's done, not just in North Carolina, but others not. So, you know, you never get active.
He's from Duke, he doesn't.
I understand. Duke's a good place. So, no, I think this is something that, I mean, I think that's a big, big question in state tax policy. What should be the mix of income versus sales? Should you go all the way and just rely on one or the other? And no question that we have moved away from income to sales. Yeah. Sir.
Good question. Most of us being real estate appraisers, I see it, and we see it as an organization, that the appraisers have now for at least 3 or 4 of these recessions that we've dealt with in the real estate industry. And over the last few months, we see these same things happening that have always occurred right before these catastrophic events. And it tends to be
Like what? Let me.
like we see applications coming in, we're appraising more properties that may be 100% lending or close to it. All right, and we see the banks asking us to appraise properties where they are now doing the 100 and 125%
Yeah.
type mortgages. We don't mind seeing the freed up money that's changing hands, but we're seeing these same
Yeah.
symptoms. So
Well, there's certainly been, I mean, we
Signs.
were in the 10th year of this economic recovery. Yeah, standards do become more generous.
yes.
The question is, have they become so generous that they've set up an issue of potential drop? And I don't yet see that in the data. I mean, I believe everything you're saying, and I know from reading other sources, yeah, that's happening, but I don't see it in the data in terms of households being overwhelmed with debt. I could show you a slide that just looked at mortgage debt, same thing, payments as a percent of income. Are there certainly situations that, well, of course, you're always gonna have people that have gone in over their head, but I don't think it's pervasive enough to me at least, how I'm reading the data, that makes it comparable to what happened prior to 2007.
Okay.
Sir?
According to some of your slides, it shows that between the years of 1950 and maybe 1983, the recurrences of the recessions were more narrow, where they were 3 to 5 years or 3 to 8 years apart. And then since 83 till currently, they've been in the range of 8 to 12 years. We're on track, if that follows that same trend, to kind of be in that maybe 12-year, which might be 2021-ish, according to your charts. What would you hypothesize would be the 3 main triggers that could cause that tipping point to begin a recession?
The most common, two, if you look back in history, 2 common triggers for recessions have been, one, excessive debt buildup, which is why I spend so much time on this. And the second would be a spike in the price of some major input that is used in the economy. The best example of that would be the 2 recessions in the 70s, which were prompted by increases in oil prices. We have a recession in the mid-70s, one in the late 70s. Energy market's totally different now, so that's not going to happen. I don't see that. I mean, when the Saudis were hit by whoever hit their facilities, there was a spike that lasted about a week, and then we're back to normal. So that's why I focused a lot on debt. I think that is still the key factor to watch. I guess the third one I would say would be over-exuberance. To
We
use
see
a term,
that a lot in our
to
industry.
use the term coined by
Irrational
Greenspan, over-exuberance both in your industry as well as in the stock market. I don't see that in the stock market. And again, I'm not yet seeing that in your industry, although I certainly respect your perceptions and your take on that. So that's why I'm in the camp right now, the 2 out of 3 camp that says, I mean, there's always a chance of a recession, but the 2 out of 3 camp that says not. And then I guess the fourth trigger would be some totally external event that we have no control over and we have no warning of, and this would be of the geopolitical type. I mean, there are a lot of people worried after the attack on the Saudi productions, if it came from Iran, was that just the first salvo of the real war in the Middle East would be Iran versus the
That was a
Saudis. And of
test.
course, we're on the Saudi side. We've got, I think we just sent more troops to Saudi Arabia. So, yeah, that would be, and of course, that area is always bubbling, and we've got some recent bubbles, so that's always in. And Mr. Kim in North Korea, if he decided he didn't want to be people's friend, and he did something bizarre like sent some missiles over to Hawaii, and
The first item you mentioned was
Yeah.
debt.
Yeah.
And how do you see, more specifically, how do you see the student debt affecting that? We being economists don't think that's not the same kind of debt, in the sense that's debt that is actually long run, if it works out, making that individual more productive, because they're borrowing money to get a better education. It usually pays off for the average person. And you got to remember, we hear news stories about someone who's got $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 debt. The average student has about $30,000 worth of debt. Now that's significant, but you need to keep that in perspective. And presumably they're taking that debt so they can get a degree, and data show if you get a college degree, you're going to earn over your lifetime about $1 million more than someone who stopped at high school, on average. There are always exceptions. So as long as that young person does use the debt to ultimately get a degree, the worst situation is you use a lot of debt, you never get the degree, then I don't see that as being a drag on the economy. Now, clearly it has affected spending patterns in our nation. I mean, it has made young people, it's increased the amount of time before, as I use the term, settle down. It's also probably changed their spending habits in a certain way, but in terms of being a drag on the economy. Now, should we work to try to somehow reduce the cost of college? Well, sure, yeah. We want to, any industry we want to be more efficient.
And I see on the NC State campus, I'm going to speak for NC State, we are really ramping up our distance learning, where students don't have to come to campus. And in fact, I'm in charge of our teacher evaluations, and for the first time this semester, I had a professor say, I can't have any classroom courses evaluated because I don't teach on the classroom this semester. All of mine are distance learning. And my point here is that there could be a future where a much more significant number of students do a lot of their coursework distance, which would mean we don't need as many buildings, we don't need as much infrastructure, we may not need as many of me either. So those are, I think we always need to work for higher education becoming more efficient. Thank you all very much. Appreciate your time.
Yes, Dr. Walden, all of that was very informative. Thank you so much for
Everyone stayed
your
awake,
time.
I think.
We're awake and hungry, but thank you again. At this time, let me get Dwight, if you don't